During the late 19th century, an Irish-American priest was excommunicated because he publicly sided with the working poor in their struggles against those who owned nearly everything and controlled the machinery of government. His name was Edward McGlynn. This is his story. My name is Edward J. Dodson. What follows is based on the book The Determined Doctor, The Story of Edward McGlynn by Alfred Isaacson. Edward McGlynn was born in Manhattan on the 27th of September 1837, a year of severe economic crisis across much of the United States. His parents arrived in New York in 1824 from Donegal, Ireland. His father, a contractor, later constructed the A.T. Stewart building called Stewart's Marble Dry Goods Palace at the intersection of Broadway and Chambers Street. Young Edward began his formal education at the Free Academy, also referred to as the 13th Street Grammar School. Later in the 19th century, the academy would become part of the City College of New York. Raised in a family devoted to the Catholic faith, Edward and his brother Andrew left New York to study for the priesthood in Rome's Urban College of Propaganda Fide. Edward was 13 years old. They were joined 3 years later by another brother, Frank. While Edward earned honors at the college, his brothers eventually returned home to follow different paths. Edward quickly became fluent in Latin as well as Italian. When a new North American college was established late in 1859, Edward was appointed prefect, then vice-rector. This photograph is of the members of the first class. Edward was now in the last year of his theological studies. One of the students, Michael Corrigan, would come to play a significant role in Edward's troubles with the church hierarchy in the future. Edward was ordained on the 24th of March, 1860. This required a dispensation because he had not yet reached the minimum age. Early in October, he returned to New York City. He was assigned to St. Joseph's Church on 6th Avenue in Greenwich Village. The pastor, Thomas Farrell, is described by Alfred Isaacson as the most outspoken of what were then liberal ideas. During the Civil War, Father McGlynn was assigned the chaplaincy of the Central Park Military Hospital. As an Army official, he received his salary from the government. With the closing of the hospital in August of 1865, he moved his possessions to St. Anne's Church located at 120 East 12th Street. There he awaited a new assignment, hoping for his own parish. Alfred Isaacson describes his state of mind at the time. He looked upon the chaplaincy of 3 years as a gap in his life in which no good was to be found. He felt he was beginning his career anew, just as if he was leaving the urban college. Over the next few years, Father McGlynn began to implement his commitment to helping others. He arranged the opening of St. Stephen's Home for Children, renting the property next to the church. The facility came to serve 500 children. In 1869 came the opening of a residence for middle-aged women. He was appointed pastor of St. Stephen's early in 1866, following the death of Father Cummings. In addition to his primary responsibilities to the parish, he joined with other priests in a theological society called the Academia, described here by Alfred Isaacson. For its time, the Academia had rather radical views. Naturally, not all views were held by all members. For its time, the academia had rather radical views. Naturally, not all views were held by all members. Abolitionists, they supported radical Reconstruction. They were for Fenianism, which they saw as a struggle for freedom, opposed the temporal power of the Pope, and were open about the inerrancy of Scripture, infallibility, and clerical celibacy, though McGlynn firmly supported the latter. The Fenian Brotherhood championed the cause of Irish independence from Britain, and New Yorkers of Irish Catholic heritage provided moral and financial support. Father McGlynn in 1865 had called for rebellion in Ireland and insisted that tenant rights be forced upon those who controlled the land. He took the opportunity to expand on his views in a lecture he delivered at Cooper Institute on the 28th of April, 1867, as described by Alfred Isaacson. He described how God had created this continent on a gigantic scale. To match this, America had a destiny to develop men who were giants in moral stature. For this, America had to be Catholic, because the Catholic alone tried to develop all human talents and applauded human progress. The unity of the Church would then unite the nation. In another lecture at Cooper Institute lasting 2 hours, Father McGlynn talked about man's relation to the natural world. In nature, the bounty and resources of this country were gigantic, and the Church praised the work of nature. Though the Church was not destined to bring comfort, it praised the development of every talent and applauded progress. Father McGlynn also had strong opinions about the importance of children receiving a public school education and for Catholics to teach in the public schools. These views put him at odds with church policy. Interviewed in 1870 by a reporter working for The Sun, a New York newspaper, McGlynn expressed his opposition to any financial aid for a religious institution as a violation of the principle of separation of church and state. He also had practical concerns. Schools made parishes large and unwieldy. As evidence of McGlynn's involvement in public affairs, copies of the interview were forwarded to the Propaganda Fide in Rome. The opposite view was championed by James McMaster, editor of the Freeman's Journal. McMaster argued that all Catholic children should be enrolled in Catholic schools and taught by approved Catholic teachers. Events in Ireland were about to take on a new importance in the United States, and among New Yorkers in particular. The Irish nationalist leader, Michael Davitt, released by the British from prison in 1877, traveled to the United States to speak on the Irish cause and to raise funds. To the people of Ireland, a great land question revolved around the absence of any tenant rights or protections from the constant demands by absentee landowners for higher and higher rents. As Alfred Isaacson writes, McGlynn thought the land question the most important of Irish questions, since home rule would be an illusion if it did not bring with it the settlement of the land question. Out in California, newspaper editor Henry George was troubled by the extent to which land monopoly and absentee land ownership were already impacting life in the United States. His initial analysis, titled Our Land and Land Policy, was published in 1871. As the grip of British authority was intensified in Ireland, a plan emerged from John Ireland, Archbishop of St. Paul, Minnesota, to encourage and fund the migration of Irish immigrants from the overcrowded cities of the eastern United States into his sparsely populated diocese. Father McGlynn presided over a planning meeting held on the 2nd of June, 1879, to put the plan into effect. When Henry George's book Progress and Poverty was published in 1880, the publisher had a copy hand-delivered to Father McGlynn, who immediately grasped the importance of the book. Henry George soon arrived in New York City to promote Progress and Poverty. His support for Irish independence and for land reform in Ireland resulted in a contract with the Irish World newspaper to report on the situation in Ireland. And in Ireland, George made contact with Thomas Nolte, Bishop of the Diocese of Meath, whose own sermons echoed the arguments made by Henry George. Despite Nolte's support for Henry George's remedy to the land question in Ireland, neither leader of the Irish national movement, Michael Davitt, nor Charles Parnell, publicly embraced George's position that all would be changed if only the government would demand payment from those who owned land of the full potential annual rental value of the land held. A month after Michael Davitt arrived in New York City during June of 1882, he delivered a lecture at Cooper Union in which he proposed that landlords in Ireland be bought out, the land then sold to tenant farmers. Father McGlynn urged Davitt to embrace the solution advanced by Henry George and Bishop Nolte. Henry George learned in Ireland from Michael Davitt of the support his proposals had received from Father McGlynn. After returning from Ireland, Henry George called on Father McGlynn in the fall of 1882 at St. Stephen's. From that point on, a collaboration between the two men began. In short order, McGlynn was threatened with suspension by Archbishop Michael Corrigan. McGlynn agreed to end his involvement with the Land League. However, this did not prevent him from delivering a speech in March 1883 on behalf of Irish charities in which he condemned land monopoly as the cause of poverty and starvation. Support for McGlynn's positions came from William Walsh, Archbishop of Dublin, who had met with Henry George and found nothing in his proposals conflicting with Catholic doctrine. McGlynn then gave Corrigan another reason for a charge of disobedience. In August of 1886, he attended his first meeting of single taxers. During the meeting, Henry George and McGlynn were appointed to a committee to form a new society. The committee subsequently met several times at McGlynn's rectory. Father McGlynn and others now determined it was essential to put forward a candidate for the office of mayor of New York City. They brought together leading socialists, labor union leaders, and others committed to reform to establish the United Labor Party. They drafted Henry George to be their candidate. The United Labor Party announced that Father McGlynn would speak in favor of the candidacy of Henry George at a public meeting on the 1st of October. A letter came to him from Michael Corrigan ordering McGlynn not to participate in this or any future political meetings. McGlynn then set up a meeting between Henry George and Archbishop Corrigan. Regarding this exchange, George later told McGlynn, "I might as well have been talking to the marble of the cathedral." Corrigan's main frustration was how to respond to McGlynn's insubordination. McGlynn countered that he was simply exercising his rights as a citizen, which he had not abandoned at ordination. Despite the risk to his career, McGlynn went ahead and spoke his plan, describing Henry George as the most unselfish man in this country, formed by Providence to preach the new gospel. Puck, a weekly magazine founded in St. Louis by Joseph Kepler in 1871, began publishing 5 years later in New York City. Its specialty was the political cartoon, and the magazine provided ongoing coverage of Henry George's campaign. Here, McGlynn plays the violin in the back row and Henry George the bass in the front row. Puck's editors had their own agenda, writes Alfred Isaacson. Puck published a total of 35 cartoons concerning McGlynn. Puck was a factor in politics and social life. The cartoons generally attempted to show a good Catholic could not be a good American. Since McGlynn held he did not lose his rights as a citizen with his ordination, his punishment was a good vehicle for expressing this view. Showing McGlynn was punished for heresy, Puck illustrated to its readers that he and American Catholics were not allowed to exercise their rights as citizens without interference from Rome. McGlynn was subsequently suspended from his priestly duties for 2 weeks. Alfred Isaacson suggests that this suspension was influenced by the Democrats of Tammany Hall. We cannot say definitely the influence of Tammany Hall brought about McGlynn's first suspension, but there are strong indications Corrigan and other leaders of the New York Archdiocese were quite cozy with Tammany leaders, a situation neither created nor fostered by acting contrary to the wishes of the other. Interviewed a short time later by a reporter, McGlynn held fast to his belief in Henry George's solution to the problem of poverty. Late in November, a pastoral letter came from the pen of Bishop Corrigan to guard the flock from poison and sound the alarm when dangerous movements were seen. As Alfred Isaacson explains, this was directed right at Henry George. The letter struck at the denial of the right of private property, the very principle which was so promising to the most depressed. The letter admitted evils were laid on workers, but these could not be righted by denying a fundamental right or perpetuating a wrong. McGlynn, interviewed again shortly thereafter, defended his ongoing commitment to systemic change. As Alfred Isaacson states his case, he said there was a panacea, and if the press and the church spread and explained it to the people would put it into effect. It was the abolition of private ownership of land and the restoration of those rights in soil now monopolized by a few. Now, to strengthen his case against McGlynn, Corrigan focused on McGlynn's administration of St. Stephen's and sought to have him removed. When McGlynn refused to resign voluntarily, Corrigan referred the matter to Rome. McGlynn was ordered to come to Rome to explain his actions, but declined to do so for reasons of poor health and lack of funds. In his response to the Archbishop, McGlynn declared, "I have taught and I shall continue to teach in speeches and writings as long as I live that land is rightfully the property of the people in common, and that private ownership of land is against natural justice, no matter by what civil or ecclesiastical laws it may be sanctioned." And I would bring about instantly, if I could, such change of laws all the world over, as would confiscate private property in land without 1 penny of compensation to the miscalled owners. In mid-January of 1887, Bishop Corrigan notified McGlynn that he was replacing him as pastor of St. Stephen's. Historian Edward O'Donnell describes what then occurred. On Monday, January 17th, more than 7,000 men and women gathered outside St. Stephen's to demonstrate their outrage at McGlynn's official removal as their pastor. Inside, a committee of 35 formalized their boycott of the parish. A huge rally followed at Cooper Union. In the first issue of Henry George's new newspaper, The Standard, which appeared on the 8th of January 1887, a staunch defense of Father McGlynn was presented to the paper's readers. George affirmed the right of McGlynn to avow political principles and to promote them, a right belonging to every American regardless of religious belief. In the meantime, McGlynn determined to form a new anti-poverty society, the first meeting of which was held in May at Chickering Hall. Reverend Hugh Pentecost, shown in this cartoon, was one of the co-founders. At Madison Square Garden on the 23rd of January, Michael Davitt also spoke in support of McGlynn, stating that McGlynn's support of the Irish cause and the 1882 speech he made on behalf of the Land League were the start of McGlynn's troubles with Michael Corrigan. McGlynn emerged from illness and silence in March to speak to the United Irish Societies, telling his audience that every great cause is religious in nature, and that if one were to pluck religion out of it, then the cause was not worth fighting for. Then, on the 29th of March, 1887, McGlynn delivered his most famous oration, The Cross of a New Crusade, at the Academy of Music. McGlynn remained faithful to his principles and values. If we read history aright, we shall see that all the great triumphs of the cause of Christ came where the Church sent out her missionaries to be the friends and fathers of the people, to teach them art and literature and science, while teaching the priceless truths of religion. The crimes and the horrors of history are chiefly due to the forgetting of that great truth, because of the sordid passions of the few, who, being stronger of mind and swifter of foot and cunning of brain, use their gifts to enslave and to rob their brethren. Events across the Atlantic in Ireland now seem to raise the stakes for Rome's judgment on McGlynn's case. Alfred Isaacson explains, when Bishop Thomas Nulty of Meath, Ireland, issued his pastoral letter, claiming the land was the common possession given by God to all, the Standard published the full text and wondered how Nulty remained a bishop while McGlynn faced excommunication. McGlynn failed to report to Rome by the 3rd of July 1887, the deadline imposed on him. He was automatically excommunicated. A letter was sent to McGlynn by Archbishop Corrigan informing him. McGlynn then went on the attack against church leadership in a series of lectures given through the summer of 1887. He also openly expressed his views on societal issues. Alfred Isaacson lists the reforms he deemed most important. Respect for rights of conscience, the separation of church and state, the United States being a beacon and refuge for all nations, the abolition of privilege to individuals and corporations, whether these be civil or religious, and only common schools and common charities supported from the common treasury. McGlynn remained active throughout the remainder of the year, while rumors circulated that his case was under review in Rome. After delivering a speech in January, McGlynn happened to make a remark reporters repeated in the next day's newspapers. And the Pope? Who is the Pope? A poor old bag of bones just waiting to drop into the grave. When Henry George decided to support the candidacy of the Democrat Grover Cleveland for president in 1888, the relationship between McGlynn, a staunch Republican, and George soured. Henry George resigned from the Anti-Poverty Society, and the two would not reconcile until 1892. George and McGlynn both attended the first National Single Tax Conference held at Cooper Union in 1890, but they did not meet or talk with one another. Finally, in December of 1892, Rome's emissary to the United States, Archbishop Francis Satolli, requested McGlynn to come to Washington, D.C. for absolution from his censure. McGlynn prepared yet another statement of his principles and teachings, which he was pressed to rewrite several times to satisfy Satolli that McGlynn's beliefs were in full conformity to church doctrine. McGlynn then received absolution. Word came to McGlynn that Henry George had expressed great relief that McGlynn's ordeal had ended in his favor. McGlynn took the opportunity to write him a letter saying he was touched by George's sentiments. During the early months of 1893, McGlynn was urged by supporters and pressed by others to honor his promise to go to Rome. With funds raised for the trip, he arrived in Rome in the middle of June and met with Pope Leo XIII for about 25 minutes. By the end of June, he was back in New York. As Alfred Isaacson indicates, the controversies were far from resolved. The Pope had received McGlynn with paternal charity in June, but complained about the lack of documents. He cited McGlynn's errors as being public and over a long period of time. The form of the reconciliation was not enough reparation for the public scandal and affront to ecclesiastical authority. Archbishop Corrigan then learned from the U.S. Secretary of State, James Blaine, that McGlynn had petitioned President Cleveland to be named the ambassador to the Kingdom of Italy. Thus, yet another controversy involving McGlynn found its way into the newspapers. The idea did not originate with McGlynn, but he did write to Cleveland requesting the position, as he needed to find employment and income. McGlynn and George, now reconciled, were keynote speakers at the Second National Single Tax Conference held the end of August 1893 in Chicago. By the middle of 1893, McGlynn's Anti-Poverty Society dissolved. A meeting with McGlynn and Archbishop Corrigan finally occurred on the 21st of December 1894. This was their first meeting since 1886. At this meeting, Corrigan offered to assign McGlynn to St. Mary's Church in Newburgh, New York. Resigned to the fact that he would never again lead a congregation in New York City, McGlynn accepted the post. His departure from New York City did not silence McGlynn's active support of single taxers. He agreed to travel to Wilmington, Delaware in February 1896 to support an effort to elect a governor and legislators who advocated the single tax on the annual rental value of land to raise the state's revenue. Single taxers were arrested for violating Delaware's blue laws. McGlynn was not among those arrested. When Jenny, the daughter of Henry George, died suddenly in the summer of 1897, McGlynn came to Brooklyn to conduct funeral services for her. That fall, McGlynn spoke in support of Henry George's second campaign for mayor of New York City as an independent Democrat. When Henry George died of a stroke on the 28th of October, McGlynn arrived later that day to comfort his wife. To reporters, he said, "He died in a struggle for human liberty. His spirit will live in the hearts of his friends. He died like a hero on the field of battle." McGlynn's own health had never been good. Now he was experiencing heart trouble and kidney problems. Even so, in February of 1899, he spoke to the Manhattan Single Tax Club. By the end of the year, he was extremely ill and died in the early evening of the 7th of January, 1900. In 1918, this bronze statue of Father McGlynn, sculpted by Edmund Quinn, was placed in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Mary Quinlan Laughlin concluded a 1908 memorial to Father McGlynn with this short poem. Here in the silent city of the dead, where world-worn hearts have found unbroken rest, our tributes of respect and love we spread upon the mound we honor most and best. His salient words seem whispered by the breeze that sighs a gentle requiem o'er his grave, while from ethereal realms his spirit sees the growth of thought he stirred in serf and slave. 3 decades would pass before McGlynn's story was documented by author Stephen Bell, a contributing writer to the periodical Land and Freedom, published in New York City. Reviewed in the same periodical by Grace Isabel Colburn, her words aptly describe the challenge Edward McGlynn accepted as a devoted adherent to the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. The story, as Mr. Bell tells it, is pitiless in its revelations of what had happened to that church, which was once the expression of a religion of service, of brotherly love. In his reiteration of his belief that the very essence of all religion is the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, and in what he endured to live up to this belief, Father McGlynn showed the world how the mighty empire of the church stood perhaps for the fatherhood of God, but had completely forgotten or openly denied the brotherhood of man.